The first book was the book Kitab al-Ruh by Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah ta'ala. Kitab al-Ruh, the book of the soul. What's interesting about Kitab al-Ruh is that Imam Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah does not restrict his conversations or his discussions about the soul to after death. But he talks a lot about what the soul encounters while it is still here of the unseen, what it encounters of the Barzakh, what interactions exist between the souls here and the souls that have passed away. And so he focuses truly on building the concept of the soul from this side before he talks about the other side. And I really found that approach to be not just more convincing and affirming in terms of the way that we deal with the subject, but also more productive for us to really realize that we're interacting with these realms even though we haven't entered into them fully yet. So it's not just a matter of time before we enter into them. We're in fact entering into them on a regular basis, even if partially, and interacting with this realm as it exists from now. So he starts off with how we're interacting as souls with that world before actually getting into that world. The second book, and these are authors that we've covered in the late night reflections quite a bit, was أهوال القبور وأحوال أهلها إلى النشور. أهوال القبور وأحوال أهلها إلى النشور, which means the state of the graves, the conditions of the graves, and the state of its occupants until the day of resurrection. And this is a book by Al-Imam Ibn Rajab rahimahullah ta'ala. And Imam Ibn Rajab rahimahullah ta'ala focuses almost, in fact, exclusively, entirely on what's happening in the graves right now. What's happening of its punishment, what's happening of its reward, what are the people perceiving, what are some of the ahadith that we have from the Prophet ﷺ about their very particular and specific states. And he purposely cuts it off at the time of the resurrection. So, ila nushur, he stops at the day of resurrection. So he gives you that overview. So he covers that time span in detail. And then you have a work by, subhanAllah, a scholar that always writes with a lot of optimism. And that's Imam al-Suyuti, rahimahullah ta'ala, Jalaluddin al-Suyuti, who wrote a book called Sharh al-Sudur bi Sharhi Hal al-Mawta wal-Qubur. Sharh al-Sudur bi Sharhi Hal al-Mawta wal-Qubur. I'm saying it slowly so that the four note takers, inshallah, in the room can make sure they get everything. But Sharh al-Sudur means the expansion of the chest. Actually, that in and of itself tells you a lot about his approach. Alam nashrah laka sadrak. Have we not expanded your chest? That there's clarity and there's expansion of the heart, of the chest, when you study these things. And so it's meant to give you great clarity about the hereafter and great foresight into the hereafter. So Sharh al-Sudur bi Sharhi Hal al-Mawta wal-Qubur, by explaining the condition of the dead and of the graves. By the way, he wrote another book called Bushra al-Ka'ib bi Liqa al-Habib, which is, if you all remember, I did a series called For Those Left Behind, which is really about comforting the grieving. And Bushra al-Ka'ib bi Liqa al-Habib is talking about glad tidings for those who are struck with grief through the meeting of the beloved. And the beloved here, al-Habib, is actually Allah Azza wa Jal. So glad tidings to the one who is grieving for the meeting that they will have with the beloved one, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he writes with a lot of optimism. He writes with a lot of intentionality towards those who have lost loved ones and are trying to figure out what's happening to them and what will happen to them as well when they pass away. Then finally, you have Imam Ibn Abi Dunya, rahimahullah. Ibn Abi Dunya, rahimahullah ta'ala, is an author who's actually prior to Imam Ibn al-Qayyim. He's prior to Imam al-Suyuti. He's prior to many of these imams. And all of them largely cite his work. But Ibn Abi Dunya, what he would do is he would list out all the narrations on a subject. The authentic, the weak, the fabricated, the narrations from the companions. So he takes one subject and he lists out obsessively all of the narrations. So for example, on the Jannah series, primarily the book is Had al-Arwah by Imam Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah ta'ala. But Ibn al-Qayyim is 80% of the time citing Ibn Abi Dunya rahimahullah ta'ala's book on al-Jannah, his narrations on al-Jannah, on paradise. Likewise, and Imam al-Suyuti is largely just citing Ibn Abi Dunya, but then giving his explanations of his books. So finally, these two books, Kitab al-Qubur, which is a very comprehensive book called the Book of the Graves, by Imam Ibn Abi Dunya rahimahullah ta'ala, where he gives all these narrations about a good ending, a bad ending, good states of the grave, bad states of the grave, what happens afterwards. And he also goes into some of the narrations about the fiqh of visiting the graves and how you should act, the etiquettes of dealing with the dead. And then there is a smaller book that he wrote called Man Asha Ba'd al-Maut, He Who Lives After Death. This is a book where it's just all over the place in terms of narration. So there's just stories about people that have interacted with the dead. So stories of children seeing their parents in their dreams after death, stories of people encountering strange things at the graves. So it's a very, I want to say mystical book, if you will. It's a treatise where he gives many, many, many stories, and it should be read with some caution because some of the stories can be even bizarre. And so it's dangerous to derive from those personal stories creed and jurisprudence, right? But instead to take them as they are, because if anyone has ever stood in the graveyard alone for a long enough time, subhanAllah, it's a place where everything starts to hit you in terms of the elements in very different ways. Like the clouds start moving in a certain way, it feels like. The wind is blowing in certain parts. The certain graves seem to give off a sentiment. Like if you stand in a graveyard by yourself, subhanAllah, you'll truly feel some of these things, and you can't derive theology or jurisprudence as a result of that, right? But he gives many of these stories, of Man Asha Ba'd al-Maut, so the living after they have died, right? And the point is for those who would like to sort through those and then compare them to the books that have been mentioned, like Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah gives rules and rulings as a result of what is being encountered. Those stories can further affirm the heart and obviously can serve as heart softeners. Lastly, by the way, there's a book that I use for every Ramadan series that I do about the Akhirah, which is a Tazkirah by Imam al-Qurtubi rahimahullah. A Tazkirah is like an encyclopedia of life after death. So the whole journey from the time that you die until paradise and hellfire, Imam al-Qurtubi rahimahullah, who, subhanAllah, as a scholar, when it comes to being able to both cite the narrations and derive rulings from the narrations, is almost unmatched. So a Tazkirah from Imam al-Qurtubi rahimahullah ta'ala is the last one that I will mention here, bidnillahi ta'ala. Of course, other than that, different books were cited in smaller capacities. Now, let's get to the etiquette of visiting the graves. The very beginning of the series was an incident with Ibrahim ibn Adam rahimahullah ta'ala. And Ibrahim ibn Adam rahimahullah being asked by someone who comes into the city, Ayn al-Umran. And I wanted to start from that premise, where are the living? Where are the living? So imagine someone just came to Dallas and they showed up in not Valley Ranch, but they showed up in a place of Dallas where it's completely dead. Let's say Josephine, Texas. No, I'm just messing around. But take a place where no one's there right now. It's just land. Okay? And they said, hey, where do I go? This is before the era of GPSs. And they said, where do I go to find the living? Where are the living at? Where are the city centers at? So Ibrahim ibn Adam rahimahullah is essentially serving that role. SubhanAllah, he's out contemplating upon Allah Azza wa Jal. He's one of the great scholars and sages of our Islamic history. And so he takes him to the graveyard, right? And this is where the story starts, and this is where the premise of the series starts. And the man is looking at him like, I asked you to take me to Al-Umran. I'm thinking, where the shopping centers are, where the people are all living. You pulled me out in the middle of nowhere to a cemetery. And he said, people, when they come here, they don't leave. So Al-Umran means the settlements. They settle here. Everywhere else people go, they eventually leave it. So he said, that's why I took you to this place. SubhanAllah, there's another incident from Imam Hassan al-Basri rahimahullah ta'ala, which I'd like to set for the premise of how we deal with the graves. Imam Hassan al-Basri rahimahullah ta'ala was missing one day, and his students were looking for him, and they found him after a while. And they said, where were you? Rahimakallah, we were worried about you. And he said, كنت اليوم عند إخوان لي إن نسيت ذكروني وإن غبت عنهم لم يغتابوني. He said, I went to visit some brothers of mine today. When I am forgetful, they remind me. They remind me of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when I am not in their presence, لم يغتابوني, they don't backbite me. They don't speak ill of me. So his students said to him, these are amazing friends, right? That sounds like the exact friend that you want. Someone that reminds you of Allah and that doesn't speak ill of you when you're not around them. So they said, can you take us to them? And he responded and he said, I'm talking about Ahl al-Qubur. I'm talking about the people of the graves. That subhanallah, when you visit the people of the graves, in nasitu, dhakkaruni. When I become forgetful, they remind me of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَإِنْ غِبْتُ عَنْهُمْ لَمْ يَخْتَابُونِ. And when I leave them, they don't backbite me. And one of the things, subhanAllah, that he was trying to set with his students is one of the most important practices to keep yourself grounded, which is ziyarat al-qubur, to visit the graveyards and to reflect upon the state of the graves. And I want you to think about when you sit with, Ibrahim ibn Adham rahimahullah was talking about where is al-Umran, where is the place where people are actually alive. Imam Hassan al-Basri rahimahullah ta'ala was talking about where the living people were. I want you to think about what Ibrahim ibn Adham rahimahullah ta'ala was talking about in terms of the place where people are living. But there's another thing here where you're sitting with people who damage your heart. You're sitting with people who live and who speak and who seem to be alive, but they damage your heart, right? Are you really with the living then, or are they killing you? So the opposite side of that is that you are sitting with those who are actually alive and who bring life to the heart. Those that have passed on to the next life are the ones that are actually living. And they have a much greater effect on giving life to the heart than sitting with the living who backbite, who gossip, who talk about nonsense, who tear into people's honor and dignity and things of that sort. So it's actually a powerful shift that the Salaf, that the pious predecessors, they looked at those who had passed before them to still be very much so a part of their lives. Whether they were their family members or not, they're still very much so a part of their lives. And it's important to think about the perspective. And everything that you try to derive from the company of people, what the company of the dead will actually do for the heart, to give life to the heart. And so this is where we find the encouragement, ziyarat al-qubur, to visit the graves. So we go through a few ahadith of the Prophet ﷺ about what the purpose is of visiting the graves and what benefits exist from visiting al-qubur. The first hadith is from Abi Hurairah radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. An Abi Hurairah radiyallahu anhu قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم زوروا القبور فإنها تذكر الموت. He said sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, visit the graves because verily it reminds you of death. In another hadith, which is from Burayda radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, the Prophet ﷺ said, إِنِّي كُنْتُ نَهَيْتُكُمْ عَنْ زِيَارَةِ الْقُبُورِ فَقَدْ أُذِنَ لِمُحَمَّدٍ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمْ فِي زِيَارَةِ قَبْرِ أُمِّهِ فَزُورُوهَا فَإِنَّهَا تُذَكِّرُ الْآخِرَةِ. The Prophet ﷺ said, I used to forbid you from visiting the graves. But Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was given permission to visit the grave of his mother. So visit it because verily it reminds you of the hereafter. What you'll notice about these ahadith is that the primary purpose for the Prophet ﷺ telling us to go visit the graves is for us to be reminded that the number one takeaway from visiting al-qubur is that you walk away and you are more reminded of the hereafter, because the things that you can do that are of benefit to those that have passed away are not determined by proximity. Meaning what? If you make dua for your deceased relative from your home, or you make dua for your deceased relative standing next to their grave, it's the same effect. If you give sadaqah on behalf of your deceased relative from the graveyard or from your home, it's the same effect. If you pass on some knowledge from your deceased relative next to them or away from them, it has the exact same impact. So the Prophet ﷺ is saying it reminds you of the akhirah. It reminds you of the hereafter, and that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you the permission to do so. Now subhanAllah, with that is an important benefit. What reminds you of the hereafter, and what is the reminder of the hereafter supposed to do to you? What's it supposed to provoke in you? If you took the general mentions in the Quran of the reminders of the akhirah, the reminders of the hereafter are supposed to get you to start praying qiyamul layl. The reminders of the hereafter are supposed to get you to start giving out of your wealth, because you feel a sense of urgency when you're reminded of the hereafter. And so you find the famous incident of Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu, that Uthman ibn Affan radiallahu ta'ala anhu, when he would visit the graves, he would cry so much until his beard would become wet. His beard would become soaked with tears. And they said to him, Ya Uthman, you hear about al-Jannah wal-Nar, You hear about paradise and the fire, it doesn't do to you what this does to you. We don't see you cry this way. And he said, radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, that this is the first manzil, the first statement of manazil al-akhirah, of the stations of the hereafter. Important lesson means that when you have entered into the barzakh, you're actually in your akhirah now. This is part of your akhirah now. And there are multiple evidences of that. I'll paraphrase many evidences throughout this talk, but the most famous one is when the Prophet ﷺ said to the man who said to him, Mata sa'a, when is the day of judgment? He pointed to a young child, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He said, by the time this child has gray hair, you would have already met your sa'a, you would have already met your hour, you would have already met your qiyamah. So the barzakh is part of the akhirah for the person that's entered into it. It's there. So he's saying it's the first station of the stations of the hereafter. If it is good, then everything else is good. If it is bad, then everything else will be bad. SubhanAllah, his grandson, you think about the urgency of what the grave is supposed to provoke. Uthman radiallahu anhu had a son named Aban ibn Uthman. He was one of the fuqaha of Medina. He was one of the jurists of Medina. Extremely knowledgeable scholar and a tabi'i. Radiallahu ta'ala anhu wa an abi. Aban had a son named Abdurrahman. So Abdurrahman ibn Aban ibn Uthman, who inherited knowledge and wealth, they said. So from Uthman radiallahu anhu, you had multiple qualities. So the ilm, the knowledge, the taqwa, the wealth. And Abdurrahman ibn Aban, when he used to go to the graveyard, like his grandfather, and remember death, SubhanAllah, I just want you to think about the sight. When he would come out of the cemetery, like the word would spread amongst the poor people and amongst those who were enslaved that Abdurrahman is visiting the graves right now. Why? Because as soon as he leaves the graveyard, he starts to free people from slavery. And he says, oh Allah, just as I freed this person from captivity, free me from the captivity of hellfire, free me from the punishment. And then he starts to give sadaqah to those that are poor. He starts to give charity to those that are poor. And this is the practice of many of the salaf, by the way, many of the pious predecessors, that as soon as they would leave the graveyard, they'd immediately spend and they'd give to the poor. So the reminder of the hereafter is supposed to disconnect you from the deception of this world. It's supposed to disconnect you from the deception of this life. And there was a practical, manifest benefit that you would see based on what the Prophet ﷺ mentioned as the primary purpose for going to visit the graveyard, is that it reminds you of the hereafter. Okay? And the Prophet ﷺ said, Inni kuntu nahaytukum, I used to forbid you. How long was the prohibition in place, and what did the prohibition entail? The prohibition was in place up until the last 2 or 3 years of the Prophet ﷺ's mission. Very interesting. Which means that up until the last 2 or 3 years of the Prophet ﷺ's life, you only went to the graveyard for the janazah. You only went to bury and then you left. Okay, there was no concept of ziyarat al-qubur outside of that, of visiting the graves outside of that. Why? Why do you think that is? Why would there be a prohibition of something so good? To avoid shirk. To be specific, these are people that are coming out of idol worship. Right? They're coming out of idol worship. And the place where you could immediately dip right back into some of those things that you have left off is the graveyard. And so there is a solidification of tawheed, a solidifying of tawheed that has to happen, of monotheism that has to happen, and the rulings of Islam being firmed in the hearts of the people and in their practices, so that they don't start to mix up these concepts, because they're fresh in Islam. They're still fresh in Islam. So the ulama mentioned in the sharh of this hadith that when people are hadithan fil Islam, they're new in Islam, they still need time to sort these things out. And the graveyard is a place where your emotions get the best of you. It's a place where there are indeed so many things that are happening, right, around you. There's adhab here, there's na'im here, there's punishment here, there's reward here. There's so many things happening. And we can see that a person can get truly lost if they don't have a solid understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that fear was subsided by that point. That's number one. Therefore, the benefit of being reminded of the akhirah overtakes now the fear of the potential falling into practices that are contrary to Islam. What that means is that if you're in a situation where the practices could actually become contrary to the benefit, the reminder the Prophet ﷺ is mentioning, then a person should be careful. Right? That this is for someone that really understands Islam, understands the nature of monotheism, understands that those that have passed do not benefit you. In fact, you are the one that can benefit them with your dua and things of that sort. And they don't get tangled into some of these concepts. So that's the first thing. The prohibition was removed. The second thing here is that there is a very specific discussion that then relates to women visiting the graveyards. Women visiting the graveyards. Because the Prophet ﷺ, he cursed those women who would frequent the graveyards. Okay? And in one narration, those women of niyaha, women who would wail or mourn at the graveyard. So there's an interesting discussion that takes place here with our mother Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha. Some of the companions understood that the prohibition on women then visiting the grave still remained, that the prohibition was only lifted for the men. Aisha radiallahu anha, al-Mu'mineen, didn't understand it that way. In fact, she would go visit the grave of her brother Abdurrahman ibn Abi Bakr, and she would make dua for him, and then she would return home. And she was approached by some of the companions and censured, like, wait, what are you doing? Like, the Prophet ﷺ prohibited and cursed the women that would frequent the graves. And she mentioned that prohibition was for everyone until when the Prophet ﷺ mentioned that I used to forbid you from visiting the graves, and that included the men and the women. And when the Prophet ﷺ then opened the door of ziyarah, she said that was for men and women. However, what would remain then? So you have effective clauses of prohibition. What would remain is the prohibition on a niyaha, which is wailing, not crying. Crying is fine. Niyaha is to wail loudly, to shout, to hit yourself, to tear the hair, to tear the clothes, which in some cultures, by the way, that's actually an expression of mourning. Okay? Like to tear something or to scream or to shout. And that hurts the dead, whether men or women do it. It hurts the dead, but it was more predominant amongst the women. And so the effective clause of the prohibition of niyaha would remain, right? And so during the actual burial, if a woman feels like she's not going to be able to hold herself and that the crying and the mourning and the wailing would overtake her, then it's better for her not to be in that situation at all. Even according to the opinion of our mother Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, to not fall into that. And then the second one, to be on the safe side as well, if it's frequency, to frequent the graves. Because that was also in the effective prohibition prior. Again, some of the schools of thought allow for, based upon what Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha is saying, and her understanding of this hadith, allow for women to visit the graves and to be reminded. And some of them maintain the earlier prohibition. The other thing that is taken from this narration is the Prophet ﷺ saying that he was given permission to visit the grave of his mother. And there's a famous narration, we talked about it when we actually covered the biographies of the mothers of the Prophet ﷺ, those who played the role of being mothers to the Prophet ﷺ, as well as his actual mother Amina. But the Prophet ﷺ went off on the side, one day during a journey, and he traveled the barren path, and the Sahaba followed him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then he came across this grave, and he started to weep heavily, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He was in deep pain. When the Prophet ﷺ would weep, his chest was like a boiling kettle pot. And the tears started to flow down from his eyes, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And subhanAllah, the companions cried with him just because they knew that what was happening to him was something significant. Then he mentioned, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that this is the grave of my mother. Ista'dhantu Rabbi, I asked my Lord permission to visit the grave of my mother, and my Lord allowed me to do so. Then he mentioned, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I asked my Lord permission to do istighfar for her, to seek forgiveness for her. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not give him the permission for that, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to do istighfar. Now someone might say, and this is especially hard for people whose parents were not Muslim when they passed away. That's a deep pain and it's a deep grief. What happens here in this situation? And so, not to get into the whole discussion of like what's the status of a person who died anyway between the time of the Prophet ﷺ receiving revelation and Isa alayhi salam's departure, right? That they existed at a time when there wasn't clarity in revelation, and they fall in the general window of those who are excused, according to another authentic narration. Not to get into that whole discussion, but just to get into the discussion, it's an important one, of when someone who passes away that wasn't Muslim, or that didn't used to do istighfar for themselves, that didn't used to pray themselves, that didn't used to do siyam for themselves. There's an important distinction to be made here. Allah Azza wa Jal has prohibited us at the hukum level, at the ruling level, from doing something on behalf of someone that they themselves did not used to do. Right? So if a person did not used to do istighfar for themselves, seeking forgiveness from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala themselves, then you can't do istighfar for them. If a person was negligent in regards to their siyam, for example, their fasting, then you don't do fast for them. Right? But there are narrations, for example, about someone that had some days that they missed, needing qada, where they were fasting. So they were a people who used to practice fasting. And so you extend them by making up fasts on their behalf. This is authentically narrated from the Prophet ﷺ. So the idea here is that our relationship with the dead is to extend what they had already set into motion. I want you to understand it in the greater framework. If they used to make dua for themselves, you're making dua for them now. If they used to give sadaqah themselves, you're giving sadaqah for them now. They used to fast themselves, you're fasting on their behalf now. You're completing fasts that they may have missed. Right? They had intended to make hajj, they weren't able to make hajj, you do hajj for them. Or they did hajj or did umrah, and you do that, you extend those good deeds that they themselves used to participate in. That's the nature of ibadah that's done on behalf of someone that has passed away, and it is under the chapter of ibadah. Now, the specific state of that person, how that person is being treated by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what that person's ultimate decree is going to be, their ultimate judgment is going to be, that is to Allah alone. That is to Allah Azza wa Jal alone. Because Allah is al-adl, Allah Azza wa Jal is the just, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-Rahman, Allah is the merciful. You're not going to be more just than Allah. You're not going to be more merciful than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If there's an excuse for that person that exists, Allah Azza wa Jal will determine that. If some excuse exists for them. But we deal with the outward and the legal and the continuation. So our prohibition from making istighfar on behalf of someone who didn't used to make istighfar, or doing dua on behalf of someone who wasn't making dua themselves, is because we deal with the outward realities here. But the inward, that is to Allah Azza wa Jal. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is making the ultimate decision in regards to a person. And so you should not delve too deeply into the individual fate of a person. Rather, the sacred connection of istighfar or sadaqah or dua is from someone who used to practice those things themselves. And so you're extending them by extending practices, and that is from the rahmah of the believers between one another. The rahmah of the believers between one another, that they are connected in that way. And so the dua then, when we enter into the graveyard, is also very telling that the Prophet ﷺ, كان النبي عليه الصلاة والسلام يعلمهم إذا خرجوا إلى المقابر أن يقول قائلهم السلام عليكم أهل الديار من المؤمنين والمسلمين وإنا إن شاء الله بكم لاحقون أسأل الله لنا ولكم العافية. When you visit a graveyard and you speak to the occupants of the grave, or you make dua for the occupants of the graves, you're doing takhsis, you are specifying the believers amongst them. SubhanAllah, I actually want to tell you all something very interesting. Right now in our cemetery, we have obviously the Muslim section in Capel. I was driving out one day and I noticed that there was a Bosnian family, Muslim family, that had a crescent on their tombstone, but it's not in the Muslim section. And I was thinking to myself, I pray that every time we enter into the graveyard and we make that dua for the believers, that it's reaching them as well. Right? And the only reason I caught it one day is I just took that route out of the cemetery and I noticed the Bosnian flag, and I noticed when I went there, Muslim names. I thought, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive them or forgive their relatives. They weren't buried amongst them, but clearly there is an indication of their Islam. And so this is a rahmah. Again, the legal connection is that the believers continue their mawadda in that sense, their connection with that sense through dua and through seeking forgiveness and things of that sort. And this is specific to the believers. And so make this dua when you enter into the graveyard. And you enter into the graveyard. And then, when you come to the Muslim section, you're making dua for al-mu'mineen wal-muslimin, you're making dua for the believing men and women, the Muslim men and the women. You're sending salam upon them. You're even reminding yourself in the nature of the dua, right? وَإِنَّا إِنْ شَاءَ اللَّهُ بِكُمْ لَاحِقُونَ. You are those who preceded us. أَنْتُمُ السَّابِقُونَ. You have preceded us, and we are soon to follow. That's the first way that you are addressing them. نَسْأَلُ اللَّهَ لَنَا وَلَكُمْ الْعَافِيَةِ. And there are different variations of this narration. They all surround the same themes. That we ask Allah for us and for you pardon and forgiveness and safety. You can connect this to the Laylatul Qadr dua. Allahumma innaka afuwan tuhibbul afwa fa'fu anna. You're asking Allah for them and for yourself, al-afiyah, to be spared and to be granted safety. And so you have that recommendation as well, meaning you can go and you can make dua for specific people in the graveyard, but realize that you're making dua for everyone that's in the cemetery that's a believer as well. Don't be bakhil, don't be stingy. When you walk into that cemetery, make dua for everyone in the cemetery, and then you go and you visit whoever it is that you want to visit. And if you want to make specific